All right, so if you're tuning in, we are not all on mute. We are just waiting as folks join the room to make sure everyone's here and present before we launch into this discussion. So if you're here already, thanks for being with us. We will begin in just a second. All right, so as people continue to join the Zoom room, I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Julia, a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, and we are live here with Jennifer Taub, Bradley Hope, and Tom Burgess discussing trends in international corruption and white-collar crime. Politics and Prose will be dropping links in the chat feature to connect you with Kleptopia, Big Dirty Money, and Blood and Oil that you can purchase throughout the discussion. If you have a question for this panel, make sure you drop it in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to questions at the final portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours this evening. Before we get started, we really want to thank you out there for joining us this evening. Your patronage enables us to have these kinds of events, and you really are keeping our spirits afloat during this holiday season. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Moderating this evening is Jennifer Taub, a legal scholar and advocate whose writing focuses on promoting transparency and opposing corruption in fiscal spheres. She has testified as a banking law expert before Congress and has appeared on MSNBC's Morning Joe and CNN's Newsroom. Taub was the Bruce W. Nichols Visiting Professor of Law in fall 2019 at Harvard Law School and is a professor of law at the Western New England University School of Law. She recently authored Big Dirty Money, The Shocking Injustice and Unseen Cost of White-Collar Crime. Tom Burgess is an investigations correspondent at the Financial Times. He has reported from more than 40 countries, won major journalism awards in the US and Asia, and has been shortlisted for 8 others, including twice at the British Press Awards. His critically acclaimed book, The Looting Machine, about the modern plundering of Africa, won an Overseas Press Club of America award. He recently authored Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World. And Bradley Hope, based in London, is the New York Times bestselling co-author of Billion Dollar Whale and covers finance and malfeasance for the Wall Street Journal. Before that, he spent 6 years as a Middle East correspondent. Hope is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and Gerald Leb Award winner. He recently co-authored Blood and Oil, Mohammed bin Salman's Ruthless Quest for Global Power. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Taub, Tom Burgess, and Bradley Hope. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you everyone for being here. It's an incredible honor to be able to moderate a panel with these 2 amazing journalists and book authors. I'd like to begin the discussion with what seems like maybe a basic question for Tom, but I'm hoping he elaborates beyond a mere definition. So Tom, hey, how are you?
Yeah. Very, very nice to be with you.
And it's 10 p.m. over in London where you are?
Yeah. Me and Bradley have stayed up late, but obviously we would be up at 3 a.m. for Politics and Prose if required.
And by the way, that wasn't my question for you. I just wanted to acknowledge how late it was for you guys. So my question is, the title of your book is Kleptopia. What is Kleptopia?
Well, Kleptopia is the global force of corruption that is conquering more and more of the world. We tend to think, comfortingly, that corruption, the use of power for the self-enrichment of those who hold power, is the aberration. We like to think that that is the system gone wrong, and our political scandals, all generally our biggest ones, center around corruption, and we see it as the terrible malady in our political systems, and then we cure ourselves of it and we carry on. Kleptocracy is what happens when corruption becomes the system, it becomes the dominant force of power. And if you look at a map, there's one behind me, if you look at a map and you just work your way across the world, you'll see, pretty straightforwardly, that the vast majority of people born today live their lives in a kleptocracy. And that means that those who hold power in their name do so for their private interest rather than the common good. And that spirit of kleptocracy, that subversion of the social contract, is spreading along with dirty money through the remaining democracies and twisting them towards kleptocracy. And I'd say the US election of recent days and weeks has been a terrifying example of that. We see it in London as well. And we see two things happening. We see a broad alliance of kleptocrats, or people ruling in the kleptocratic spirit, like a committee that never meets to meet, right? We see Trump forming a loose affiliation with Putin, with Kim, with Mohammed bin Salman, and so on. People who are united in their urge to privatize power. And then we also see under the surface, in the kind of reporting that Bradley and I and others are trying to do, we see actual business alliances, actual corrupt financial flows connecting these different kleptocrats around the world and starting to form this global network. And it's that global network and the violence that underpins it that is Kleptopia.
I want to follow up with you on something you just said before I move on to a question for Bradley. I like that you have articulated a definition of what corruption is, more or less the misuse or the appropriation of power for a leader's personal gain at the expense of, or instead of supporting the general public that you're supposed to be leading. But what I'm interested also in is the way in which, in some countries, but not all, corruption is perfectly legal, sanctioned by the state, or de facto, because those in power don't hold people like them accountable. And so I wonder if your book kind of scans the globe, although it does zero in on certain countries, but where you think the possibilities for accountability under the law is, and when, in contrast, accountability isn't true accountability, but it's instead used by leaders, for example, Putin and others, to only crack down on their enemies and reward their friends by letting them grift. Can you comment on that?
So when I was reporting on the book, I spent a lot of time back in Central Africa. That's the part of the world where I've worked longest as a foreign correspondent, well, all over Africa really, but for the book, especially Central Africa, and spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan and places where there is no law, or only the simulacrum of the law. And then I spent some time in London and DC and Paris and elsewhere where we considered the rule of law to hold. And I came across a lawyer who's involved in an extraordinary global kleptocratic power struggle around an oligarch called Mukhtar Ablyazov. We can talk more about him if you like. He's one of the four kind of novelistic threads that run through the book. And this lawyer who works for Ablyazov, who, depending on who you believe, is either kind of the biggest crook since Bernie Madoff or the Mandela of the steppe. This lawyer came across a work of German legal scholarship from the 1930s by a guy called Ernst Frankl, who was a courageous Jewish German lawyer in the 30s, who stayed in Germany far longer than was safe for him to try to chronicle what was happening during the rise of Nazism from a legal point of view. And as far as I know, it's one of the very few, if not the only, real first-hand study of kind of the jurisprudence of Nazi Germany. And he comes to this theory of the dual state. And I think this is the answer to your question, or one way to look at it. The idea of the dual state. So you have the normative state, a state of laws. And in Nazi Germany, Frankl concludes it's there to allow capitalism to keep going. So you have some rules, and they do apply, and they are enforced by the court. But then you also have the prerogative state. So that's the raw power state. That's the Nazi machine. And what that has, again, quoting Frankl, is jurisdiction over jurisdiction. So the normative state, the state of laws and rules, can function, but at any given moment, the political machine, the raw power machine, can either absolve itself from accountability to the law, or reach into that world of rules and grab you out of it and drag you into its world of raw power. And that kind of dual state, I think, is what we see emerging. So that's what happens in Russia. That's what happens in Kazakhstan. And I think increasingly that's what happens in Western courts as these kind of dirty money disputes get transplanted from kleptocracies into democracies. And again, what we see is the anti-corruption campaign being used as the weapon of the corrupt to take down and purge their enemies. And it's fantastically well described at the start of Bradley's new book.
That's a perfect segue to Bradley. Thank you, Tom. So speaking of this dual state that Tom has mentioned, the way in which the prerogative state, where the corrupt leaders do what they want, versus a kind of normative state where there's some law-abiding folks, brought us to the very dramatic opening of your book, Bradley, Blood and Oil. And if you can, similar to Tom's book, I think what makes these books so incredibly strong is that we're learning theory and history through these very compelling narratives of these interesting, powerful, and incredibly corrupt characters. So your book, if you can tell us a bit about it, but where it opens up with MBS taking control and imprisoning his cousins and extended family in the Ritz.
Sure. Well, I like to really focus in on the kind of the true stories of these cases, and for me, maybe at the end of writing the book, sort of I get more broad ideas about what we're looking at. In Saudi Arabia, it's one of these kind of Forbes lists that we see around the world and stuff. It gives us a sense of who are the richest people on earth, but they're terribly skewed and inaccurate. Those lists are really the people who sort of comply with Forbes or who have easily traceable money. But if you were to actually look at the world's richest people, many of them would be in Saudi Arabia and then UAE and these Gulf countries, where the wealth is just extraordinary, in large part due to completely legal and long-running corruption. So, I thought I knew something about corruption after working on the 1MDB scandal, but when I started to work on Saudi Arabia, I was really startled by how much worse it was actually in Saudi Arabia than it was anywhere else I'd ever seen before. It's just one of those things where people weren't really worried about it in a sense, because they thought, well, this is a rich country, it doesn't really matter. But the kind of corruption there was extraordinary. So, but it's a very interesting experience because so the book itself is essentially the biography of Mohammed bin Salman, focusing on his rise to power from 2015 till present. And he's an extraordinary kind of Machiavellian character. On one hand, kind of has a true reformer buried in there somewhere, and on the other side, he's a pretty terrifying autocrat at times. And this, for me, one of the most seminal moments that really embodies his entire complex personality was this, what they call the Ritz shakedown, where he summoned all these princes, top business people from across the country, and then arrested them all simultaneously and brought them to the Ritz-Carlton, which was promptly turned into a kind of luxury prison. And what really struck me about really digging into that event is that it had several layers. On the top layer, there was a true corruption problem in Saudi Arabia, and this was a kind of a short circuit approach to how do we send a signal that that era is over, the era of unbridled graft. So there was a genuine reformer intention to that level. But then if you look closer at the list of people who were arrested, it is selective, and the people that were chosen for this privilege were primarily also the people that were his rivals for power. So I think that's the interesting thing you find is there are true anti-corruption inclinations, but then there's also selectivity that is about power in those countries.
So perhaps to ask you both this question, I guess it's kind of two, or it's that how do we avoid, if we want to, whether it's countries where you reside or here in the US, the hijacking of our legal institutions by the corrupt? And then separately, if you can speak to either of these. Although your books focus mostly, for the most part, on corruption abroad. Obviously, the West, or I should say more particularly the US in this case, plays a role in Tom's book, Donald Trump is this kind of shadowy figure who makes an appearance and is sort of tied into much of it, either directly or by analogy. But with you, Bradley, I mean, part of what allows MBS to have so much power is how he's so successful at courting the West by sort of throwing us some sort of hope for reform, whether it was gender equality or making noises and going on his sort of tour of the US. Then I guess pieced in with this, the US we always hold ourselves out to be still the shining city on the hill, the place where our banks can be trusted. But it turns out maybe that's not the case. So I wonder if you can speak to, in your work specifically, or in your other research, what we could be doing better in the US, not to both court global kleptocrats, but also to elect them.
Do you want to go, Bradley, or me?
Go ahead.
I mean, I wonder which bit of that to go for. I'd say, I mean, there's one of the things that really struck me again and again was just the power of the idea of the state. So, like Bradley, I've been trying to report the human stories down to the most tiny details, and then perceive the bigger forces behind them. And I remember I spent a lot of time trying to work out what happened one day in May 2013 it was, when a mother and child of Central Asian mother and child were kidnapped in Rome. They're the daughters of a kind of dissident oligarch I mentioned earlier, Ablyazov. And it's a terrifying moment, especially for the child, when not the private spies who've been following them for a long time, but the agents of the Italian state seize them, bundle them onto a plane, and fly them back to Kazakhstan to face what they quite rightly believe will be the most terrifying fate. And the lawyer involved in that case, he had this absolute realization of what he called the presumption of regularity, of how we will do what the state tells us because by and large we think the state is legitimate, and it is the expression of society. But when it's hijacked, it becomes the most powerful weapon. So that's why Mohammed bin Salman and Putin and every other kleptocrat is so desperate to shift their assets and hire lobbyists in DC and New York and London and Paris, because those guys are selling the one thing that they can't steal, which is legitimacy, right? Legitimate power. And I thought I might, can I read a little bit? Just to try and make this, to try and make something of this point. It's a little bit off your question, but there are two just short passages. I thought it might be better to read something that I spent some time working on rather than just off the cuff. And the two moments in the book that I thought really contrasted. The first one, so it goes to what you're saying. The first one is a moment with a woman called Rosa, who is a single mother, lives in Kazakhstan, and has an amazing distrust of authority. Joins a picket line, becomes a leader, goes of a strike against corruption in the oil industry in which she works. And then one day, the response of the security forces loyal to the dictator of Kazakhstan, they respond to this long-standing strike by opening fire in the public square on Independence Day. Rosa survives the shooting, but then she finds herself in a detention center. So this is the first little bit, and then I'll go to a little later bit for a contrast. Men in plain clothes walk Rosa into the detention center and down a corridor with doors leading off to each side. They led her to what she took to be a commander's office. There she was shown a list of her relatives. She was questioned again and again, men shouting at her, but she didn't understand what answers she was supposed to give. One of the men had a scar on his face and a malevolent air. Ruslan was his name. He came towards her carrying a carrier bag. He whipped it over her head and pulled it tight. She gasped for air, but none came. At last, Ruslan released the bag. Rosa felt her head swim. Then suddenly the bag was back on, her body writhing in panic. Again, Ruslan asphyxiated her, and again and again. When the bag split, he went off to find another. His colleague took over. He slapped Rosa's face, grabbed her neck. He seized a fistful of her hair and dragged her from her seat. When they took her back to her cell, she tried to tidy herself. As she composed her hair, a clump of scalp came away in her hand. Then the torture of Rosa goes on. I must say, some of the most harrowing stuff I've ever reported. And then we come to a point where they start to threaten her daughter, and she says, and we rejoin Rosa, she would have done anything to protect her daughter. She wanted to protect everyone. Others could betray her if they needed to, if it would keep them out of there. By any means, truth or lie, let them not end up in here, she thought. She would have done anything, but she didn't know what it was she was supposed to do, to say. What had happened, she thought. And this is, I think, the terrifying thing. And I think I'll read one more little bit, but I think you see it in Bradley's book absolutely as well. And also in your book, Jennifer, how what we're talking about really, it comes down to just control of facts. It's no surprise that this kind of corruption and this crisis in American democracy is the corruption is linked to the disinformation, because they're both ultimately about destabilizing the truth and establishing a narrative. So here's a very contrasting little bit of the book about establishing a different story and being able to erase the past and rewrite the present in a way that Rosa was being forced to do. When it came to picking winners, Felix Sater could be content that he'd chosen the right Kazakhs, just as he had grasped how to yoke his own interests to those of the CIA and the FBI. We're meeting Felix here after an extraordinary career, as you can imagine. Now an altogether more audacious bet was about to pay off. He wanted to be there to witness the moment in person. His taxi arrived. "Hi, how are you?" said the driver. "Do you know who I am?" said Felix. I'm not going to do the Brooklyn accent. It would be an embarrassment for everyone. No, I really don't know you. Felix showed the driver a business card, in order, the driver thought, to demonstrate that he was a VIP. They set off towards Midtown, across the bridge that linked his Russian roots in Brighton Beach to the Manhattan money man he'd become. He and the driver talked a little about the evening's remarkable events, but Felix spent most of the ride on the phone, speaking in Russian. They drove towards Central Park, a few blocks up from the bar where all those years ago, the margarita glass in his hand had connected with a face that would need 100 stitches to close its wounds, the moment that had propelled him into this life of secrets. The car pulled up outside the Hilton. Felix had booked a room, but none of those present planned to do any sleeping. For nearly 3 hours, the excitement in the Hilton's ballroom mounted until the place was humming. It was as though from this boxy chrysalis on 6th Avenue, there was about to burst forth a thing of truth and beauty never before seen. At last, at 10 minutes before 3, it was done. The metamorphosis was complete. The ballroom filled with music. A fine American composition, the theme from Air Force One, a film scarcely less plausible than the exploits that had brought Felix to this point on this night, in which a crazed Russian nationalist holds a US president hostage. And then there he was, high up on the gantry, waving down to his people, the winner, the reality star, the man whose name had been the final, crucial ingredient in Felix Sater's magic potion for transforming dirty money, Donald J. Trump. That's how he makes his entrance. And I think, to come to your point, what we're talking about really is the hijacking of the state, isn't it? It's the hijacking of the central institutions that are meant to protect us and making them into weapons that in the hands of predators.
I have to say, everything that you just read from the story, Rosa's experience, and then you move to this next part, because Sater is obviously linked to these brutal figures. there and in Russia, and then bringing him in the taxi to Trump. I mean, it made me gasp when I first read it, and now. And I think I really can't recommend these two books more, because I think it's when you see these figures that are commonplace in today's history linked to these linked to this whole system, these whole networks in the globe. It helps us understand, especially when I speak here to an American audience. We've gotten better at it, but we don't always look beyond our own shores to understand where we are, and that's critical right now. Let me ask you, Bradley, and I'll return to you, Tom, to talk more. But Bradley, can you read us a passage? Maybe you have one selected from Blood Oil.
I don't actually, but I did have a kind of a comment in response to your original question.
Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot about that.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. I just was going to say that, I actually don't often think about the word corruption itself, because in a sense, it's sort of like a not necessarily the most important concept. So for example, with Mohammed bin Salman, what I think is quite interesting about him is his power is in part built upon just the fact of the flows of money that emanate from his control. And they are legal flows of money. They're not necessarily corrupt. They're not stolen by any legal definition, because under the Saudi Arabian government and the kind of the founding of the country, the king and the son of the king, they have control over this enormous wealth. But so in my journalism, I often just think about, I'm just really sort of obsessed with the idea that money is the quickest way to understand the truth of a situation. And so on one hand, a kleptocrat type character might be stealing money and using it in one way, but then on the other hand, someone like Mohammed bin Salman is just wielding the massive financial flows that he controls to embed himself in the world in a way that it's very hard to remove him. A lot of people wonder why is it that Mohammed bin Salman didn't face stronger repercussions after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And of course, one answer is he had a strong ally in Donald Trump. But another answer that I think is probably even more profound in a sense is that he had become the greatest technology investor in the world. He was paying the most fees to the most banks. He underwrote an entire tens of billions of dollars infrastructure fund that was actually building infrastructure in America. So he was doing it for a financial return, but and as a result of this, all of the people that are top donors, people like Steve Schwarzman, they are the bridge between him and Donald Trump. It's not just the personal relationship between Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump, but it's the way that he does that. So for me, that's really the fascinating thing. It's these money flows and especially these enormous money flows are so powerful. They're more powerful than just about anything else, and the repercussions are both big and small. I think people don't even realize, but this war between these Gulf states, this kind of Cold War about, who's going to be the dominant force, it spills out in our country all the time, because they're all paying all the lobbyists and and it becomes a kind of a major topic of discussion, whereas probably it's not actually a major concern for Americans who leads among the Gulf countries as much as it is for their own interests, and so they really dominate the stage in a way. And so that's why I don't really think about corruption so much as I just think of the power of money.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Tom. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I was just gonna say, I think it's fascinating, that approach, but I was always struck when I was a correspondent in West Africa and there's a good book, Leif Wenar's book about, it's called Blood Oil, which is missing the and, Blood Oil. And it's nowhere near the great read yours is. It's a sort of a little philosophical book, but that book, and also Steve Cole's Private Empire, they both come with this idea of, sure, technically Mohammed bin Salman's money might not be corrupt. I suppose it's arguable, but what about Obiang in Equatorial Guinea? These guys write their own laws, but ultimately it's about legitimate and illegitimate power. I don't think even the biggest Saudi apologists could make the case that the House of Saud rules in any consensual way. And the entire basis of the global economy, the founding stone of it is the oil industry, right? That's what keeps everything moving. And the overwhelming majority of that involves corporations that aspire to be seen as sort of global corporate citizens, of Exxon and Chevron and Royal Dutch Shell, all the rest of them, doing business that requires them to pretend that blood-soaked venal dictators squandering the natural patrimony on their own interests and their own protection and murdering anyone who crosses them, having to pretend that these are the legitimate rulers of their countries. And it's that lie that allows people like Mohammed bin Salman to have the power they have, isn't it?
Well, I suppose in a sense, I'm hesitant to overly simplify Saudi Arabia because, it's a country that truly has a different political history than and never really embraced the kind of democratic movement, and actually, to some extent, even the kind of clerics of Saudi Arabia helped create this concept that criticizing the leader is itself a kind of dividing of the Muslim population. But, I think the thing about Mohammed bin Salman that's probably different than some of those dictators is he's not necessarily just only lavishing the money on himself. I mean, he's in a way, he has a kind of world building hubris, so he's building projects that he thinks are necessary for the future of the country. Their merits are debatable, but it's not like he's just building, effigies of himself and that sort of thing.
Let me ask, without agreeing to your definition of corruption or the corrupt, I like this, I find it intriguing. And maybe if we say for a moment and set aside whether what is happening there meets a definition of corruption or simply meets a definition of not being what we consider democratic and that there is such a great concentration of power, whatever. Here's my provocative question. If we look at someone like Rosa, or we look at Jamal Khashoggi, right? She is tortured because she was resisting what she perceived as corruption and illegality in the oil industry where she lived. And we look at Khashoggi, who was a journalist, who was speaking out against, he was critical both of the House of Saud. He's also critical of Donald Trump. And apparently we believe he was, that MBS sent his henchmen to kill him in the Turkish embassy, right? What if, here's sort of the lead up to the question, what if the problem is resistance? In other words, if everyone just, if these leaders, if these are benign dictators, or, or if we have such a complex global society of, what is it now, over 8 billion people, maybe the only way to have social order is, again, this is not me speaking, it's a hypothetical, but the way to have social order is to have nation states where the leaders have a lot of power, just like corporate leaders have a lot of power. And maybe people should just obey and not resist and not complain, and they'll get their food and they'll have their families and they'll get their education and they'll live their lives and their kids will run around in their yards and they'll have puppies to play with and so on. Like, is the problem the leaders or these resistors?
I think that's an interesting question. I think, I would love to know what the average person would choose, stability and, steady income and safety versus freedom of thought and that sort of thing. I think, a lot of Saudi young people are torn by the situation in Saudi Arabia right now, because on one hand, this is the first time, when all those guys were thrown in the Ritz, they actually were kind of cheering because those are the same guys that were stealing so much that they couldn't get a job. The average Saudi person was unemployed, and they were unable to get a job and get married and have families and buy a house and all those things. There's true poverty actually in Saudi Arabia as well. So they cheered that, and then on top of that, they were opening movie theaters and they're playing music in restaurants, and these things we take them for granted in the rest of the world, I guess. But for them, this was like revolutionary. Women can drive, and then on the other hand, if you walk around Riyadh or any of the major cities, and you try to have a discussion about anything political, it immediately there's a very, uncomfortable air, because they know that they're at risk of being arrested or targeted or, put on a blacklist as somebody who's not with the reform plan, and I think that's the problem with these, where in countries where rule of law isn't the basis. So Saudi Arabia, rule of law it is derived from the king. There's not like a document that comes first. The king comes first. He can at any moment, he could actually snap his fingers and say, up is down and down is up, and it would be the law. That's the way it works there. And I think that's the problem, because there's no one to be accountable to, I guess.
Which is, I mean, obviously I'm somebody who can't shut up, and I would not do well in a society that doesn't allow dissent. I get that. But let's look over here in America, where now, even without a dictator, with the control of, with this new, complete explosion of social media, you can create propaganda and create and sort of harness people who believe in conspiracy theories to do the same thing, right? So I'm not for shutting down speech, but we're kind of in a bit of a pickle now. Tom, your thoughts on this? Should we just chuck democracy or what?
Well, I thought you did a pretty good impression of Marie Antoinette there, putting that case. And I think she's a good person to bring up here, because essentially, pretty much since Louis XIV's head was cut off, the dominant political argument, as certainly in the West, has been that diluting power is the way for more people to have a good life. And I think now we often hear this argument about, and I think the rise of China is the central piece of evidence made to advance it. We often hear this argument that democracy and stability are somehow opposites. This is how China has successfully advanced into large parts of Africa by pushing this argument that development only comes with authoritarianism. And I would say that the opposite is true. And if you look at the longest, the last decade in China, we'll have to see how that works out. But the longest running periods of successful alleviation of poverty and massive improvements in what matters in life, health, education, and so on, have come in systems where power is very broadly shared, essentially starting with the French Revolution and going on through the Industrial Revolution, through the sort of mixed economy period after the World Wars. And it goes for Nigeria too, or anywhere like that. If the lesson of corruption is not that it creates corrupt dictators create long-standing, stable polities. They create wonderful times for cabals over 30 or 40 years, and then they create massive explosions that shatter all those institutions. And compared to how long it takes to build an institution, 30 years of one dictatorship is nothing. It's peanuts. And then all of that is gone. Whenever there's a coup, everything's reset to zero. I just don't buy the idea that authoritarianism is stable. I think that is the lie. I think that's the big lie. That's why when the Kazakh dictator Nazarbayev security forces massacre people in Zhanaozen and torture Rosa, that's why he turns to Tony Blair to help him write a speech that he can deliver in Cambridge about stability, about how, and the chapter in my book on that is called Stability. That is the myth they peddle, that you have to be with us because we'll keep things stable. We will control, we'll keep an eye on the terrorists. We'll keep the oil price steady. We'll prevent separatism, whatever it may be. These are the kind of the myths that allow kleptocrats to gain a kind of geostrategic legitimacy.
So speaking of, I want to shift to something more concrete and a bit away from our political theory. So speaking of Nazarbayev, I guess he's not the president anymore of Kazakhstan, but he still has a leadership role.
Yes, father of the nation. No, leader of the nation. El-Basi is his title. Leader of the nation. He's also head of the Security Council. And yeah, a sort of stooge is technically the president.
But he's still kind of in control, and he's a important figure in your book. But it also turns out there's an actor in the new film. I do not remember the actual title of the new Borat movie, the Sacha Baron Cohen film. But it does.
I believe it's a subsequent movie film. And in the beginning of the movie, this is where Sacha Baron Cohen, playing Borat, meets with him and is sent off on his mission to America. So, in making that that kind of fake documentary, Sacha Baron Cohen puts his life kind of at risk, does some kind of crazy things. And so it brings me to the reality of, that you both are real journalists. You do serious work, but you also take, it seems to me, kind of serious risk on the ground. And I wonder if in the reporting of these books or your other work, you can talk about an instance that you remember of your risk taking, either moments where you weren't sure you were going to get out okay, or moments where that that boundary, which is supposed to maybe between the observer and the observed, got blurred, and you found yourself in the story. And maybe, do you want to start, Tom? Maybe you have some ideas on that. Yeah, Bradley, do you want to go? I mean, I'll go. Okay, are you okay? Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few along the way, scrapes. I would say, the thing I must say first, though, is that it's always the source is at greater risk. Like, however dangerous things get, there's always an unnamed source who can't leave. And who can't get a plane to get some R&R, and who hasn't got, like, a newspaper paying the medical insurance if it all goes wrong. And it's the sources whose risks are greatest and who deserve, massively, but by far the greater sort of recognition, which is the one thing they'll obviously never get. I remember a sort of crucial moment really in my career and my life was January 2010. I covered was the correspondent for the Financial Times in Nigeria, and word came to us that there had been an outbreak of violence in the center of Nigeria, and where the sort of broadly Muslim north meets the broadly Christian animist south. And we got to this place, it's a city called Jos. Used to be known for the sort of beautiful summer breezes and strawberries, and descended into this kind of horror of violence. And we made it out to one particular village where the entire, every inhabitant who hadn't fled had been murdered, had been slaughtered, and people had been forced into wells. When we got there, women were being pulled out of the wells, and then they found some children who'd been burned to death. And we, on the way back we tried to sort of document this as best we could. And on the way back to the city, we missed the end of the shoot on sight curfew that had been declared. So we were suddenly stuck outside in the dark. We're in a situation where anyone outside was supposed to be shot. Luckily, the Nigerian army is pretty loose. Well, luckily for our situation, the Nigerian army is pretty loose on following orders, and we got a lift back into the center of town. But I mentioned that story as well because these two books I've done now, and a lot of the way about how I sort of think about these things comes from really grappling with that massacre. I ended up with sort of diagnosis of PTSD a year or so later, and really falling into a big hole. And it led me to really grapple to how we tell these stories quite often about, ethnic hatred and religious violence and so on. And what I'd say what we're really talking about is the manipulations that corruption causes. So Nigeria, a country that's run on patronage, basically its only connection to the outside world economically, essentially, is selling oil, for which an enormous amount of dollars comes into a pot in the middle. And whoever can seize control of that pot gets all that money. Or gets control of all that money, and it filters down in the opposite way to in a democracy, how taxation filters up and holds to account those who spend it. So around, money comes in at the top and is dribbled down to manipulate those who receive it. And if you, I went back to Nigeria, and I really tried hard to figure out what had gone on in Jos, and at a really local level, and even in those villages. And you can see how ethnic manipulations are being, ethnic identities were being manipulated by those who were running a sort of patronage system, a corrupt system of enriching themselves from the Commonwealth. And if you seize power to enrich yourself, you have no claim of loyalty, no real claim of consent. There's no bargain by which you say, okay, in 4 years, I'm going to tell you how many roads I've built and how many schools I've opened and how I've sort of balanced the budget. That's all that you will say all that, but it'll be complete rubbish. What you're doing is, your pitch is, I'm going to spread the money that I steal sufficiently to get loyalty, but beyond that, I'm going to use the one other technique I can use, which is tribalism, essentially. And you have to use that to such an extent that it becomes weaponized. And that's why, for me, you end up with children burnt inside houses.
I mean, I agree with Tom about also the danger to sources. That's definitely important. And then I'd add to that also the danger to local journalists, because obviously the journalists based in those places, whether it's Malaysia or Mexico or Pakistan, those journalists face huge risks that are way beyond any risks that we face in a physical sense. And I also feel like, for me in the last 7 or 8 years, I've been much more of a financial reporter than an on-the-ground reporter. I did the Arab Spring and saw a lot of exciting stuff then. But as a financial reporter, what kind of a risk do you face? Well, you face legal risk. I think Tom's feeling that probably. I've been through a lot of that, and the legal risk is actually, I mean, it can cause a kind of a constant state of anxiety, because a legal letter sounds pretty scary when you receive it, especially in the first time you receive one, and often they come, like in the case of Joe Low, we were getting them like all the time. I mean, just nonstop. And then the kind of ancillary from that is, if you've got these, hugely paid lawyers, then you've got private investigators as well. And I've had experiences where I was meeting with somebody who's kind of seemed like an interesting source, but every single word that was spoken in that conversation became a transcript that was part of, questioning my intentions and that sort of thing. And London is one of the great surveillance capitals of the world in terms of private intelligence. Every day, well, maybe not in the COVID environment, but every day on a non-COVID day, there's teams of 6 to 8 people following people around London, and they'd have no idea. And then probably the most potent risk of all to any kind of investigative journalism project is cyber risk, because that's something that you really can't protect yourself against, in a sense. As much as you think you're taking all the right steps, if some person with means decides to buy a 0-day exploit and use it against you, then they can. I mean, they can. If someone's really intent on getting inside your computer, they can get inside, and it's almost impossible to protect your sources and all that sort of thing. So you have to really, I think those are the things that I think about more than physical risk, in a sense. But in a way, they cause similar anxieties,
Thank you both. We have about 11 minutes left, and I know we have a hard stop at 6. So I'm gonna, if it's okay with both of you, turn to some of the questions. So let me start with the first one. This is from Una Derakovic. Question: very interesting books and fascinating conversation. In your books, you focus on the corrupt kleptocrats, Putin, MBS, JAMA, and the list is long. But we should also consider possible solutions to this serious global problem. What would be your advice to democratic leaders and the global anti-corruption community you'd like to take who would like to take on this serious form of corruption? Would an international anti-corruption court be a possible way forward?
I'll answer very briefly, because I'll just give a fast answer so we can try to get through all three. But I'll just say the good news is like in the case of 1MDB, that is a case where international cooperation between the U.S., Switzerland, Singapore, Malaysia, when there's a good government and not when it's not a good government, but they've actually managed to bring cases, freeze assets, make a difference. And I think we're going to enter a time, well, so long as the values are strong in those countries about this kind of thing, we're going to see more of that kind of international cooperation. And it's a huge disincentive, because it's, even it's something, as I often think, we think that the whole world is overrun by kleptocrats and stuff, but even one single article that's written about something that's not going right or something a bit shady has huge impacts. Like, some guy who's doing something shady, he gets written about in the newspaper, in the Financial Times. Suddenly, all of the banks that he deals with are calling him up and asking questions. I mean, of course, there's lots of ways around that, but there are impacts of what's happening. So I think, rule of law and trying to take on these cases actually is quite impactful.
I'll say something very quick. So very quick, because it'd be good to get through a few questions, wouldn't it? I'd say I'd completely agree with what Bradley says. So, buy your newspapers, lobby your MP. It's not rocket science. It's the institutions of democracy that will matter, and keeping them vibrant. Also, I'd say the elimination of front companies is an idea whose time has finally come. It's insane that you can use money anonymously, I would say. But money is a social token, and there really isn't any good justification for being able to use it anonymously.
Well, I want to kind of combine, if you all can also see if you can see the Q&A, we've got maybe a couple questions that could be combined. The one from James Little asking whether the US and UK are essentially oligarchies. And we could combine that one with Phil Livingstone's book, a question about whether, about sort of, Eric Prince and the Trump administration's ties to Russia. I think those two go pretty together, as well as that last one. Again, there's these from Holly Farashant. There's these three questions that deal with either the US and the UK and whether we are oligarchies, and specifically zeroing in on what's going on in the election in the US or the quasi aftermath of the election.
I mean, I'll try to answer, in a sense, this idea, is America an oligarchy? I would say no. My argument would be no, but it is that we are a country that worships billionaires still, and billionaires have inordinate power, whether it's through a super PAC or just being able to consult with the president. And so I think that's kind of a vulnerability in a sense, because, I've definitely come across people who are exceedingly rich, but they don't really have the qualifications to advise the president on anything. And in particular, I mean, you can become very rich making knickknacks that are sold in the grocery store. And so I think we have a kind of obsession with money, and we treat it as a symbol of someone's wisdom. And I think that's probably, it does kind of pollute our democracy to some extent.
Yes. Which bit? Sorry, I just lost my thread here. Which bit was I going to pick up on? Oh, Eric Prince. Yeah, I'd say Eric Prince is one of the fascinating figures of this kind of emerging global kleptocracy, because he sort of, well, he plugs into so many things, but one of which is how you get wanton violence when the kind of checks and balances on power break down. But also he's for me, he's on a line that starts with kind of Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s of the kind of like market fundamentalism, if you like, the vogue for privatizing public services, which, you can sometimes make an argument for, sometimes a persuasive one. But I'd say that kleptocracy has really latched onto that as a legitimizing argument, whether it be kind of the ersatz kleptocracy of the Russian transition, which was essentially just an enormous heist dressed up as kind of McKinsey-style capitalism, or the sort of the IMF pushing privatization of basic public services on poor countries. You get these moments of incredible resistance, like in Bolivia and Tanzania, when people stand up against water privatization, and the idea that the profit principle is always carries as a moral force, that covers a multitude of sins. And I'd say that Eric Prince's idea, which is fundamentally to privatize the most basic public service, which is defense, is sort of the pinnacle of that. And I think I have a feeling that Eric Prince is going to be a prominent player in this world for some time, just because he does embody that principle of everything, of nothing being immune to the profit principle.
I'll just say one thing about Eric Prince is I think he's an extraordinarily overrated person in a sense, because, you know, people make him out to seem like he's got these private armies and he's doing all these things. But I would say he himself would struggle to point out a single case where he actually had an impact. You know, you always hear about these kind of crazy transactions with like helicopters going into Libya, and it's like the answer is always like it didn't work out. You know, whatever the thing was didn't work out. So he's kind of like a luxury item for a kleptocrat. You kind of want to have like an Eric Prince, like, you know, like a mercenary entourage, but it's mostly for show. You know, I mean, I just don't think he's that impactful.
Sure, but he does spread this meme, if you like. He's a great disciple for spreading the idea that the national security should be outsourced, essentially.
Yeah, that's true.
He's sort of one-man lobbying shop for that, and I think a third of US intelligence is outsourced now, and that feeds a lot of the private intelligence companies that you were talking about so rightly earlier, that then the next day will be working for the Kazakh dictator or for Putin or whoever it may be, and blurring the line between being accountable to the people, if you like, or to a nation state, and being accountable to an oligarch.
I agree.
But yeah, he does that more effectively than actually, private wars or whatever it may be.
So we have a question about Russia from Miriam Isaac, who says, I would like to hear more about kleptopia or kleptocracy in Russia. It seems the country was corrupt from the czars to Stalin till now. I think what she's asking there is how much, you know, we seem to be talking about something new. Are these patterns, how deep of this is something embedded in the expectations of a culture? Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I would just say to that I think that's a fair point. I mean, I reread Dead Souls when I was working on the book, you know, going back to a period not that long ago when a large part of the Russian population was quite literally owned by a small rich group. I think that what's so different and what we're grappling with now, and Bradley makes the point so well about MBS spraying money around, for instance, Silicon Valley, is that it's gone global. These kleptocracies used to be relatively self-contained, but now they are plugged into a global economy, and it's almost as though there are sort of networks of kleptocratic power that really float above states, that they use state power and they capture state resources, but they're not accountable anywhere.
And we could go on and talk about this for another 2 hours. It's fascinating, but we'll have to leave it there for this evening. We want to thank Jennifer Taub, Tom Burgess, and Bradley Hope, and to you out there watching. Your activism and interest in these topics enable us to bring you this type of programming, and we wouldn't be able to do so without the book sales to support it. So please follow the link in the chat to purchase Big Dirty Money, Kleptopia, and Blood and Oil, or you can visit politics-prose.com. And while you're there, make sure you check out our updated events calendar for all our updated listings. And from one bookseller to another, we will see you next time. Stay safe, stay strong, stay